Madam Speaker, about 50 million people in the world suffer from genetic defects that are resulted in incurable abnormalities within their DNA, which means that they live lives which are worse than their counterparts and are dangerous for them and likely to predispose them to extreme physical pain within the course of their lives, extreme discrimination and extreme difficulty. They're the kind of people that we think we can uniquely benefit outside government in this debate. We're going to prove that from opening government. So, firstly, let's do some setup. We think that we would both legalise this and also make it mass available to all people everywhere where they might want it. We would roll this out as a publicly funded option for all people, it would be free and it would be globally provided. Secondly, we think that there would be regulations on the usage of these kind of things. So firstly, we think we'd obviously proceed with informed consent of people who partake in this. Like, obviously we'd ask both parents whether they would be happy to do this. I think that's kind of an important thing to stand by. Secondly, we'd probably have things like we have in a lot of other forms of kind of like cosmetic medical procedure, like a cooling off period to be able to make a decision about this and then later on decide that you want to retract that. We think obviously very active having children is something that people think about a lot. We think they're not going to proceed lightly in this regard. We think it's important to allow them to be able to make informed choices about this. Obviously we provide the kind of medical support that people would likely want to be able to do this. Secondly, we think that it is really important to know in this debate where the science is currently at in relation to gene technology. We don't think that the science related to gene technology is really about the kind of trite claims that get wheeled out in these debates about race or disability, because we think in a lot of those instances, things, particularly about race and gender, are quite complicated in terms of how they manifest themselves genetically. We don't know a huge amount about DNA, so the likely procedure that people are going to opt for, if you've got a clarification, I'll take in a second, the kind of procedures that we already know kind of suffer from particular genetic mutations and lead to particular conditions. So that's things like single cell gene mutations or single deletion mutations in terms of chromosomal deficiencies. Those are the kind of things that we think we can deal with. We don't think we're necessarily going to get people being able to change race genes. We'll be able to enhance their physical abilities or their intelligence to an enormously massive level. Yeah, clarification.
Well, would you also legalise this technology for an existing person, as the topic implies, doing it while
yeah, obviously. We would also do that. Note that that's often quite a lot more difficult because of the way in which genes are beyond the point in which someone's born are no longer pluripotent, so that means they often can't transform in particular ways. We think we can give particular benefits to people, for instance, about being able to change aspects of their genes that might be enable to them do things like procreate in the first place. So often people who suffer from particular genetic abnormalities might want in the course of their lives to be able to shift certain aspects of their genetic structure in such a way they can reproduce. So those are important benefits that we can claim as well. Finally, we think that there's often, we think that in regard to DNA in general, as I said, we think that we know relatively little about DNA, and that means that people are often likely to err on the side of caution. That means they're unlikely to embrace procedures that might be more dangerous. So for instance, in the case of something like race, where it's controlled by a huge amount of genetic material, people are incredibly worried about the kind of mutations that might go wrong, so they're unlikely to do things that endanger their children. The first thing I'm going to prove in this speech is that parents are loving people who care about what their children are likely to be like and are likely to choose things sensibly. Firstly, we think the vast majority of people who choose to have children do so as an act of love, and an act of love for their children. Crucially, that means they're unlikely to do things that are going to endanger their children. That's what I said and set up. We think more importantly, it often means they have expectations about their children being reflective of who they are as people. So for instance, if me and Katie were going to have a child, it would probably be combining some aspects of Katie being a redhead and me being a socially insufferable, pretty shit debater. Like, we wouldn't probably bring into the world a kind of dashingly handsome Seamus or kind of world's champion Kevin Lee. Like, the likely things we're going to do, try to enhance particular things about ourselves that are important to us. We think the kind of decisions that parents are most likely to make is to stop their children from suffering from extreme and excruciating pain in the course of their life. They're likely to be things that stop their children from dying young, being able to not be able to achieve the kind of things that people would want for their children. Secondly, we think most people don't choose particular expectations of what type of person their child is like. Often, as I said, they choose things about what the kind of life circumstances their child is likely to be like. We don't think that means they're going to act in a discriminatory way. What kind of concerns do you think people would have in this debate? We think it's, as I said, about particular aspects of genetic information that lead people to particular risks in the course of their life. So for instance, things like haemophilia, which is a genetic disease that people have for a very, very long time understood and know about, could easily be solved by particular gene mutation therapies that are available to us. Things like PKU, which is a disease that children contract very early on in their lives, which means that they can't ingest amino acids or they will die, are things that significantly curtail your ability to live a meaningful life. We think those are the kind of things that people would screen for. That's an important benefit that we bring to this debate. What are the benefits that we can bring from side government? There are a few of them. The first, this massively improves people's overall quality of life. It means that people don't suffer from the kind of pain, discrimination, disability that currently afflicts so many people worldwide. And we think that's really important because if nothing else, we can prove that people are likely to avoid those kind of things that make life significantly less worth living. Secondly, we think that this means that parents are in a much better position in this debate. We think, firstly, it means that people who desperately at the moment want children and choose not to have children because they're worried about the potential risk genetically that entails, able to procreate. And we think that is a meaningful thing for so many people all around the world. See the fact that so many people use unsuccessful things like IVF treatments. We think a lot of women around the world are often very worried about passing on disadvantageous traits to their children and choose not to have children. Like, I can't name the number of people in my family who've been like, we have a family history of schizophrenia, we don't want to pass it on, so we're not going to make decisions about our sexuality and our ability to procreate because we're worried about those things being carried on. We think that's a benefit that we can claim. Thirdly, we think we save an enormous amount of money in this debate because it means that we can use the money that would be saved in terms of preventing people from suffering from these illnesses, the enormous amount of palliative care that often goes into keeping people alive for prolonged periods of time because they suffer from incurable illnesses. That's the kind of money we can save and devote to the most important things in this debate, which is caring about people in the present and caring about diseases in the future that are difficult to resolve in a kind of non-genetic sense. So we think saving that amount of money is really important in this debate. Finally, we think it's important to note in this debate that this is not disenfranchising of current people with disabilities or current people who suffer from particular problems. Yeah, I'll take you now.
How many people do you actually think are going to use this technology?
I reckon like everyone would use this technology if they could stop their child having PKU. Like I would really struggle a lot if my child could not move, could not ever live a meaningful life, was likely to be in excruciating pain to the age of 5 in which they would die because they were unable to eat protein. Like that would be really shit. I would use this. I think you probably would too. So I think this is not been particularly bad for people who currently have disabilities. We think most people with severe disabilities would probably say something about their life like, I think I have a meaningful life and it's important to me, but I don't necessarily want my child to suffer from the same disadvantage as I do. So I don't think this is an ableist policy. We think it's one in which we can acknowledge the fact that having a disability is not a problem in the world, but it is something that you would prefer that you didn't have to live with. And we think that's a meaningful thing that people would be able to choose. We think firstly, in terms of current disabled people, the huge pool of funding that we would make available by the fact that people will not be diagnosed with these instances in the long run means for current generations, we can care a lot about those people. Secondly, the stuff about procreation is really important. People who suffer from things like Down syndrome at the moment find it very difficult to produce children because their genetic mutations make that almost impossible. That is also true of people who have things like XXX chromosomes or sex-related chromosome deficiencies. We think those are the kind of people that can have meaningful decisions and make meaningful decisions in their life right now. Often we can solve those particular issues, or if not, make their lives better. Finally, we think there will be a discussion raised about the limitations and abilities that people with disabilities have in this debate, which is unique to side government. So you can say things like we would happily screen these out for future generations, but at the moment we can recognise on that basis that we should care about this current generation because they face obstacles. At the end of this speech, all I can do is prove to you that millions and millions of people will not suffer from painful, life-ruining diseases in the long run. We've won this debate. We're so proud of this.
If it is true that having a particular mutation or a particular trait is going to make life inherently harder for you in some ways, then the only way that this government bench can win is if they prove that in every single instance of somebody having that trait or having that mutation, they will choose to remove it. That is because, as I'm going to tell you in a second, the second you allow this and the second that some people are able to opt into doing this, it becomes indescribably harder for the people who are not able to or maybe do not want to select out for those kinds of traits to fight for the kind of structural change that will actually make life more meaningful and better for them. And that's why if it is about helping those kinds of people, we will prioritize the method that does not place the responsibility of doing that on the individual person, but creates broader societal change that means that even if you are not able to remove that trait, life is still okay for you. Quickly on kind of what I think we are mostly really talking about in this debate, because I think like deleting, for instance, the haemophilia gene in an egg is obviously not modifying a person's traits, which is where I think this debate primarily lies. If obviously the technology to screen for things like genetic mutations in the egg or the sperm, maybe we would screen for those now. And while they say, well, obviously this kind of technology is harder in adults, so we're not really talking about deleting them in people who are already, adults or already existing in the world and stuff like that. I think this debate mostly probably happens in the future because they use examples like a schizophrenia gene, which we obviously have not identified or know now, which implies that we are talking about a future, place when it is not that much harder to pick and choose genes in adults as well. But also, even if it's maybe not immediately available now, obviously if you still normalize doing this for kids or babies right now, then it is also will be normalized at the point at which that technology becomes more readily available in adults to do it there. And so we think all of the harms of doing this in adults are still relevant harms in this debate. Firstly then, on why we do not think, assuming that this debate is about picking and choosing and enhancing traits in people at various points in their life, why can you never consent to that? There are a few reasons why you can't. Firstly, because there are obviously existing norms, that there will become norms about features that you ought modify. No, this is distinct from saying there are norms that certain traits are not desirable, which maybe, like Gav will say, but those are just legitimate reasons why you would want to get rid of those traits. We are saying specifically when you normalize getting rid of those traits, there will now be norms that you ought to modify certain traits, not just that those traits are maybe undesirable or not great, and those kinds of norms are likely to operate quite strongly if people are en masse deleting those kinds of traits. Secondly, we think that there is an inherent lack of coherent information or understanding as to what deleting or enhancing or modifying particular traits actually looks like. Like, what does, for instance, deleting a stubbornness gene look like? It is unclear how that actually operates and interacts with a person's, for instance, other traits and other parts of their life. It is unclear how it will manifest differently on a person-to-person basis, especially when you are doing it early in children, for instance. Often also, the way that you consider traits in yourself or as part of your existence is an inaccurate understanding, because it is often based off very highly emotional or one-off experiences. You are unable to fathom how a particular trait or a particular aspect of your physicality, for instance, all of the multitude of nuanced and complicated ways in which that interacts with everything else you are as a person and the day-to-day experiences that you go through. So you're likely to base it off kind of the worst instances of things, or the most extreme instances of you noticing something about that trait that is likely to be inaccurate. So there is an inherent lack of understanding that you can have about how what this actually entails. Thirdly, we think obviously this is very vulnerable to coercion, even if it is maybe not obvious. It is very easy for instance, your parents or your partner or people in your life to pressure you to get rid of a trait. Or for instance, obviously, if a job application will probably, even more so, for instance, have a list of traits that are seen as desirable, and you will now feel like you have to delete out those traits, for instance, or take on those traits. And coercion can obviously be internalized in a way that means it is unclear whether you have been coerced, and therefore it's not something you can legislate out, for instance. Fourthly, because you uniquely probably cannot opt out of this decision in a way that means all of the other reasons why you can't consent are just amplified and magnified, and are even more reason why we ought care. And finally, because you cannot know at the point at which you are modifying a particular trait what it will be like to then live as a shell of your previous self. That is to say, you can no longer reference your past experiences to guide your future decisions, because all of the memories and the experience and the lessons that you stacked up about yourself and how you navigate life will no longer be relevant when you have gotten rid of a trait and are therefore no longer that person. It is incredibly difficult for somebody to fathom what that experience will actually be like, having to navigate life without a trait that made you previously, and that is something that is particularly hard for people to consent to. We shouldn't let people think they can consent to that. Then, what are all of the harms of allowing this policy? I'll take closing.
I think the issue with this argument is you give a lot of reasons why people are actually likely to be really cautious when they make it. They're unclear what it looks like, they might misunderstand themselves, there's a lot of risks to it. Aren't there reasons why people will make a little cautious to a decision?
I think maybe it is true that you will be cautious to an extent, but obviously when people, for instance, start deleting out traits that are seen as undesirable, there will also be an incredibly high, burden for you to also get rid of those traits in yourself. If many people are getting rid of a particular trait, you tell yourself that that trait is not good in you. You tell yourself that you are not a good person or are far from the ideal person as long as you have that trait. And obviously those norms, in the same way that norms always do, interact with your cautiousness. Maybe you will be cautious, but if people start doing it, it is from there kind of not a big step for you to think it is something that you also ought to. What are the harms of this? Firstly, like I said, you can no longer reference your past experiences to guide your future. That is likely to make life much more difficult for people to live in a way that is meaningful or kind of sensible. Secondly, it diminishes empathy for people who are dealing with things that are perceived as negative traits that other people are deleting out, because instead of saying, kind of here is how you can cope with that, or here's how you can deal with that, the argument is instead that you ought just get rid of that or take on a different trait that would make that not a problem anymore. Thirdly, I just think to some extent that homogeneity is often bad, particularly with things like mental traits, which the topic talks about, because many traits which are maybe perceived at first glance as being bad are often good in some ways. For instance, I think stubbornness is a good example. Things that you may perceive to be negative are often good things that we want to have sprinkled throughout society in kind of, at least to some extent. Fourthly, it makes self-improvement probably harder for people who do not want to modify those traits, because there will likely be less structures in place that enable them or encourage them to self-improve. They are just pushed to get rid of those. Fifthly, noting that this is still likely likely to operate in a classist way, not just because of the money cost, but also because you are more likely to be able to access educative opportunities, to be able to make this, if you are cautious, choice in a way that is well informed, for instance. It is likely to be mostly kind of the wealthier people who do this. What that means is not everyone can access this technology, but as I flagged in my intro, structural issues will no longer be addressed because the vast majority of people now will no longer have this trait. That makes life harder for the people who have to continue to live with that trait and have to continue to face the obstacles of that day-to-day life. If we care about making life meaningful for people who have flaws that make life a little bit harder for them, we ought to do that universally, not on a case-by-case basis where some people would always be left behind.
I think the biggest problem for this opening opposition is that the science that would allow you to get rid of things like stubbornness is literally hundreds, if not thousands, of years away from coming to fruition. Where the science is currently at is what Seb tells you in his speech, which is that we are able to delete chromosomal abnormalities or genetic mutations that currently give people terrible, terrible diseases. And that means that even if this debate is supposed to hypothetically account for the situation in which you might change personality traits that are unfavourable, that is likely to be a debate that has to happen in 1,000 years' time. We should prioritise the literal millions of people that will be born with diseases right now that are incurable, that they would not have to live with over that next 200 or 1,000 years, as opposed to the few people that might be worse off because they feel pressure to get rid of their stubbornness in 1,000 years' time. I think that wins us the debate alone, particularly given we get absolutely zero engagement in Emily's speech about any of our benefits, except to say they think it falls out of the debate. So I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. The first is, what type of traits are we talking about in this debate? And the second is kind of just whipping Seb's material about what kind of outcomes we think we necessarily get. So firstly, on what type of traits we think we are talking about in this debate. Emily tells us in her speech that, well, we can already screen for other things, and that means that necessarily we can support screening out chromosomal abnormalities. The problem is that obviously screening for things is different to being able to actually functionally remove them. So removing them is a genetic modification or an enhancement per se, as this topic would have it be, whereas screening for things is just identifying those things as existing. The important difference there is that you can screen for things and determine that maybe your child is likely to have a really serious illness and then maybe abort that child as a consequence of that, but you can't just let that child come into existence without that particular disease in the first place. I think that's a benefit that we claim on our side of the house, that you're unable to get through things like screening, which is really, really important because it means, one, more people are likely to have these children in the first place that otherwise wouldn't exist, but then the quality of life of those people is likely to be improved anyway. Even if you're convinced, though, that this debate isn't just about chromosomal abnormalities or where the science is currently at, though, it at least falls into this debate because it is a form of genetics that you can modify at the present stage that science is at, and that means they have to engage with it, even if they think that there is a world in which this debate necessarily becomes about personality traits. But secondly, let's talk about like personality traits and what that would actually mean. They say, well, this is really bad because, you know, like you're likely to change aspects of your personality, that's likely to be like a kind of bad decision for your life. I think the first thing is, this is really unresponsive to all the setup material that we bring you in Seb's speech about the ways in which you are likely to go about making these decisions. And that is if the case of you're talking about a child that is yet to be born, parents love their children and they want to craft them in their image, so they are unlikely to do things that are materially going to detract from the way that that child would otherwise exist or continue to exist. They're unlikely to make huge rafts of genetic modifications to that child for the reason, as Seb tells you, that gene mutation is a complicated science process. It is often very risky, and most people wouldn't want to endanger the life of their child materially as a consequence of maybe wishing that they were perhaps less stubborn, as Emily tells you. So I think that means that in most cases, or in a very small number of cases, would people elect to necessarily alter their personality traits, and perhaps we're talking statistically more about people who would screen out or get rid of things like genetic mutations that are otherwise likely to ruin their life. But importantly, Emily also says we're likely to remove the things that are most unpalatable by society because these norms are created. I'll deal with in a second why we get no analysis about how these norms actually materialise, because you are unlikely to be like to everyone, hey guys, yesterday I had an operation to get rid of my stubbornness gene, isn't that great? Like, it's just unclear to me how that becomes a norm and expectation that you won't be that way. There's no mechanistic analysis about that. But the problem also is that like lots of the things that are most unpalatable are actually really harmful. So even if we take them at their absolute best, which is that people get rid of unpalatable traits, to me, that seems like a propensity to be violent or disproportionately angry in a way that means that it's good if you get rid of those traits because they cause active harms to other people and they're often things that like you have the least amount of control over. Finally though, I think that most people, if they're talking about personality traits, obviously have a degree of control over the extent to which they let their personality trait dictate their life. And that might mean that I'm very stubborn. That is not to say that I have absolutely no control over my stubbornness and the way that I behave. And that's important in this debate, because if we are only talking about personality traits, you have the capacity to self-modify or self-censor the way you choose to let those affect your life. And that means that when faced with the prospect of undergoing a risky genetic mutation procedure, where, as Emily points out, you might feel like a shell of yourself thereafter, you are less likely to do that than just actively attempt to change the way that you feel. Finally, though, I think it's unlikely that people feel like a shell of themselves thereafter. And I think, interestingly, similar logic is also used against trans people to say they shouldn't be able to transition. I think people are able to make informed decisions about the place they find themselves in their life in the way that a cosmetic procedure might change the way that you feel about yourself or the way that you live your life, but we still let them make that decision because they are best placed to make decisions about themselves and what's going to happen in their life. In any event, I think all of this is really predicated on the fact that this would happen in the course of people's lives. As I said, the science is just like not there, so I don't really understand why we're even talking about it. It's probably about babies who don't even know they have these traits, they grow up without ever having them. I think that's probably fine. Okay, let's talk about practical outcomes in this debate. They give you two. The first is that it becomes harder to overcome structural barriers necessarily, and then this is called self-harm to individuals who feel bad about themselves. I think I've already proven that this is most likely not going to cause people to feel bad about themselves, but I think that in an overwhelming number of cases, at the point that you feel so shit about yourself, you want to genetically modify yourself, you're likely probably to feel a bit better after you do it, because the reasons that you've come to that decision are not taken lightly. But secondly, in terms of kind of the structural analysis that we necessarily get in terms of what outcomes this has, and if closing has a POI, I'd be happy to take it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Set manifest strengths the most attractive man in the dating. What proportion of people do you think would agree with that?
Maybe like 5%. Okay, so in terms of reducing structural funding for people with disabilities, I think that the first thing to point out here is that, as Seb notes, most people are likely to do this when we're talking about illnesses, just because like they don't want their children to have really horrible, painful lives, and that means that on net we have a much bigger amount of money to deal with a much smaller number of people with these particular disabilities in the first place. But secondly, I don't think people's logic around whether or not you think something money necessarily tends on like, has this person chosen this outcome? For example, lots of the reasons you get cancer are very preventable. They're poor lifestyle choices such as smoking or lack of exercise or poor diet. But that doesn't mean we don't fund cancer research, because people don't correlate those two outcomes necessarily in the same way. And I think that's important in this debate. Also, the reasons why they say people would choose to have these illnesses, like presumably if they exist, they are persuasive. They're convincing someone to have a child with a particular illness or a particular disability. Those are probably likely to sell also to people as a reason why we should spend money on it. Finally though, this is better for children in particular, because if it is the case your parent is really pernicious and wants to change you, they will love you more if you were like that, and that means that you have an improved quality of life necessarily, and people are likely to feel better about themselves. People are also less likely to resort to worse outcomes. For example, if you don't want your child to be like as least fair skin as you are, you're likely to resort to things like whitening creams throughout the course of their life, which are more harmful. So I think on practical outcomes, we also win this debate. We propose.
Opening government's obsession about talking about where technology is currently at actually reveals why it would be so dangerous for us to thrust ourselves into loving CRISPR and loving altering fetuses and young children without actually knowing what we are doing. Because the reality is, a lot of what they talk about either is also speculative, or is something that can be done at least 90 to 95% of the time with proper research into, for instance, screening the zygote of an egg or screening a zygote of the sperm. What this does though is it changes the question of what genetic material should we say, like, allow a parent to choose going into a child, to saying we should allow parents or the medical profession or individuals to fundamentally change someone's existing genetic material and change their personhood in a way which necessarily lays the groundwork for maybe a slow or maybe a rapid decline into the ability for people to decide that their genetic material can be what they want to be without necessarily understanding the full implications of that. The first question I'm going to ask in this debate is, does this technology stop immediate suffering? As we explained in a point of information, in Emily's speech and in my introduction just then, there are significantly easier ways to stop diseases that manifest in a gene which we currently have the ability to edit out. For instance, you can definitively screen the zygotes which go into a sperm and an egg. We also think, to some extent, we are allowed to legalise the editing of those zygotes unless opening government wants to claim that an egg is a person, in which case, like...
On a point of information,
yes.
they still have genetic material.
yes, but they're not a person, and this topic is about persons. Like, you can also edit the genetic material of a plant legally because they are not people. Okay, so taking your best and say that there are genetic conditions. So we think the vast majority of these kind of genetic mutations can be recognised at the state level. So say, for instance, you're talking about Huntington's disease. Yes, you don't know what genetic material will create Huntington's disease, definitely, but you do know what genetic material you can edit out, and you can edit it out at the point pre-combination, and that is what we would support. Even in the cases where you couldn't do that, why do we think that this is a very small benefit? The first thing to say is that we think that there would be a significant number of people who would use this technology. Again, if we're talking about like where technology is currently at, currently getting the amniotic fluid scanned at like 12 weeks or 18 weeks or whatever it is actually a really difficult, invasive procedure, which means someone is significantly more likely to miscarry. We think that a lot of largely medically illiterate people would not make the decision to have that scan, and presumably would not also make the decision to edit the genetic material if it is as dangerous as this opening government team says. Why then is the message when that child is, for instance, born with a disability, that the parent made a mistake compared to, say, this pre-combination idea? We think that currently there is a sanctity of understanding somebody's personhood, which we would like to remain sort of sacred in a certain way, because that means that when someone is born as a person, you ought to deal with who that person is. That same kind of narrative doesn't exist for the idea that all eggs and sperm should be combined in a petri dish, because that's not people's natural understanding of this. We think that fundamentally changes the idea of personhood. And now, when someone is born with a disability, you don't have the excuse of like what you literally have now, which is just like, we had sex and the child had a genetic disability, because actually it's that you decided not to do a procedure which people told you that you should have had. This genetic material was open to you, why didn't you get it scanned? We think that that is an incredibly pervasive narrative, and that can exist in the back of people's minds, even if it's not necessarily always said at the forefront. But also in response to Katie when she's like, but lots of people have cancer and it's their own fault. But yeah, the problem is lots of people, genetic diseases already only, like they might, like each individual genetic disease only affects a small number of people. You presumably want to make it a small number of people, otherwise you get no benefit. So we think it's really hard to get that political capital around it, especially if you're likely dealing with, for instance, poor people who weren't medically literate, or people who are, say, from a minority religion who oppose this procedure in some way. That means that even if a smaller number of people have these genetic diseases, we think that it makes life so much worse for the people who do have these genetic diseases that we would not be happy to do this technology. The final thing we note though is, again, with this obsession with current technology, the current technology is a bit shit. Like the one CRISPR babies that have been born, like I'm pretty sure they think that like they changed their traits in some way, or possibly they made them more predisposed to other genetic issues. Like we would prefer not legalise it now if that is the argument of opening government, but also we would never legalise it because of all the reasons we just gave. More importantly then, how does this technology therefore like be established, and how does it get used? The first thing to say is that we think fundamentally people do not understand genetics and would make bad decisions to do this. We think traits or even physical characteristics are incredibly complex, because when Katie is like the alternative is skin whitening cream, that mistakes the ease with which this false science will be portrayed, which is if you're just like, I could make my kid white, we think that that's something significantly, like it's problematic to buy into, but you could see a pathway for how it gradually becomes easier to buy into, because there's a norm about the fact that you should give your kids the best life possible, and that you should do those kind of things. We think that people often don't understand what they're opting into. And in the case of traits, but also looks, it's associated with high emotion experiences in your life. So when you're thinking about like your race or your stubbornness or the fact you're timid, you're more likely to remember the worst instances of your life, rather than actually when most of your personality is important, which is just like the drudgery of the everyday, and you forget about that when you make the decision, and we think that's really problematic. I'm happy to take one from closing. No? Okay. Finally, no. On the idea that people will be cautious. The first thing to say is it doesn't matter if people will be cautious. We are saying this is always the wrong decision because you can't control it. But also, there are lots of really dangerous things that make people vulnerable that you're still not rational about. Like, obviously, every day in the relationships you have or the risks that you take, like when you speed or whatever, people should be cautious, but maybe they are not cautious enough, or maybe they are not rational enough because of the fact it's tied to high emotion, because you think it's the right thing to do. Because you have this bias which is to think what I currently want to do is the correct thing to do, or the assumption that like maybe you can just opt out of it. And even if you literally understand you can't opt out of it, the idea that you would do something and your life will be changed forever is something that's really difficult to understand. Note then the material we give you, which is that once you've made this decision, and you've fucked up, not only have you fucked up, but you're also ill-equipped to deal with that fuck up because you're now not the person who made the decision. And Katie is like, aren't you just like being transphobic or whatever? But the issue is that like you're literally making a decision for a future you that doesn't exist because some of your personality has been deleted. Like it's not about becoming more you, it's about changing who you are. And we're saying that's a decision that no individual can ever make. And they especially can't make that decision when the decision you make to change your race or to change your personality sets a norm for what it is that everybody else should be doing, and a norm that's likely to be bought into in a particularly coercive and a particularly unequal way. That's why we oppose.
Both sides in this debate rely on the assumption that there will either be regulation on the government bench or there will be no or poor regulation on the opposition bench. We're going to be the side that proves that the regulation is likely to happen, is going to be incredibly thorough, and is going to be going to ameliorate a lot of the harms that the opposition bench are immediately concerned with. What do we think this regulation is likely to? Is this like a microphone, or is this just like acoustics? What do you think this regulation is likely to look like? Firstly, we think it's going to, it may inform things like banning some of these procedures. We think it's pretty likely that you could, for example, put a cap on like how many personality edits you could make for the risk of something like, just like being really cooked or whatever, because you have like 2 personality traits, or I don't know. And we think that's pretty likely. Secondly, we think that we might mean that you limit the accessibility of some of this stuff until we're sure about it. So, for example, the knowledge we have about the genetic code is improving, but it's not quite there yet, so we might limit it to the things that we're sure about these genetics and how they interact until we gain further information to a requisite level and those tests are proven to be safe. And I think the analogy here is something like abortion, in that when it came out, when it first became accessible, it was incredibly heavily regulated due to it being a vastly new procedure and there being a lot of moral quandary sort of around it. And we think that regulation is likely to evolve in a similar way, except in this instance, the regulation is likely to be clearer for these reasons. Firstly, why is this regulation going to exist? I think the first thing to say is that it is incredibly possible to regulate this thing, and that is because the technology, as both teams concede, is developing incrementally. That means it's incredibly easy to regulate it in stages. It means that you don't have to have the same, confusing debates every single time, because you can just have the debate about specific things, not the concept of editing genes as a whole. So, for example, you can have the conversation of, is Down syndrome meaningfully similar to Huntington's disease? And are we willing to regulate Down syndrome versus Huntington's disease versus their cyber future where we edit out the fact that some people are annoying? I think you can have those as separate conversations due to this regulation. The second thing to say is that it happens in the context of state control. This is being developed by governments in universities largely, and is unlikely to be dominated by private corporations for the reasons that I'm about to explain as to why governments have incentives to regulate. 4 reasons. The first thing to say is there's a democratic mandate to do this, and that is because the majority will always want access and equality to this technology. That is true for a couple of reasons. The first is most people will not have the absurd amount of capital to hire their own fucking CRISPR, do-it-yourself kit like they do for teeth whitening or whatever, and will have to rely on government services to access that and make that accessible. The second thing to say is that the government has huge incentives to make it accessible to everyone because they want to save money on things like medical care, so they have incentives to make it accessible to the people that wish to access it. The third thing to say is that lobby groups will be strongly encouraging people to act cautiously. We think there are a lot of concerned interest groups, people like parents, people like disability advocates, people who are of various religious persuasions who are going to be advocating for caution, and that is going to temper the conversation and make sure it doesn't accelerate to the point of dystopia that OO thinks is going to happen. The fourth thing to say is that the government is afraid of liability, because if you edit a bunch of genes out, then everyone dies or whatever, that's bad. The fifth thing to say is insurance companies also have this incentive as well, so there is going to be corporate pressure in different directions in that respect. The last thing to say is these incentives don't just point to general regulation, they're likely to regulate how people access this technology as well. This might mean things like meaningful conversations with your doctor about what is actually involved in genetics. It seems wrong to me that there is a stubborn gene. Like, that just doesn't feel true, which, as we know, is good analysis in debating. But, you know, just things like, it might mean explaining to people that some stuff is a little bit genetic, but a lot of it is environmental. So when you do this procedure, you're unlikely to get this outcome. It might actually involve a lot of, like, enforcing that people accessing it through a doctor, so it's likely going to be good in that respect. The third reason why there's likely to be regulation is that creators of this technology have incredibly strong incentives to make sure it is regulated before they license it or make it accessible. The first reason is that it's going to be developed, and it is being developed, with the existence of ethics boards and layers of these ethics boards, because firstly, to receive government funding, you need to pass a requisite level of ethics, and these ethics boards are often staffed with different people, like scientists, for example, but also people like lay people and ethicists, which create a diverse perspective on what the ethics surrounding this technology is likely to be, even in the inception of touching various stuff to do with genetics. The second thing is, like, no one wants to be like the eugenics guys, so everyone's like, no one wants to be like the founder of CRISPR talks about a dream that she has where she's engineering a pig and it turns into Hitler. People are deeply concerned with how that is perceived, and it's going to be attached to their legacy, so they're going to make sure that they're not being the eugenics guy. The last thing to say is, like, the funding is often tied with passing requisite tests, and those tests are often more stringent than the ones that we would apply. For example, governments have different standards, publicly funded universities have differing standards to, for example, private corporations, and those overlapping regulations often mean that creators are unlikely to license that technology when it's going to be bad. I'll take closing if you've got one.
Sure, yeah. Sure, maybe things like suddenness might be ambivalent as to whether they exist as a gene, but things like attractiveness or things that are correlated with attractiveness would be. Do you think a lot of people choose to line up with those particular ideals of attractiveness?
I'm going to talk about now why individuals are unlikely to do that, and why this norm is likely to evolve in a way that preferences things like survivability as opposed to attractiveness. So I think that will answer your POI, and the answer I think is no. The first thing to say is lots of individuals have strong incentives to make it not evolve in that way. That is because, firstly, genes are incredibly close to people's identity. So, for example, the fact of what your face looks like and this is really just borrowed from OL, which is why I thought it was strange that they were making that argument, is that people see their identity as bound up in their physical appearance and are unlikely to want to rob their children of that as well, unless they're talking about people with, like, almost like a requisite level of self-hatred that I think would not pass the test of accessing this technology because they're not making a rational decision. Because if you imagine the pitch of sitting down with your doctor and being like, I just have the fucking worst nose in the world, and they're like, that's not a good enough reason to edit your baby's DNA. Like, I think it would be quite hard to do that. The second thing to say is they have the most information about their condition and are able to do it in a way that makes that it have the most minimal intervention possible to get the outcome that they want. And this is responsive to OA's material, which means that they're likely to proceed cautiously because they're afraid of having that be enacted in that way. Why, even if this regulation doesn't happen, will this norm still evolve in a way that kind of makes a CO more comfortable? We think, firstly, just generally there is a more educated populace. That means that you have doctors who are better and are better at their job. But secondly, you do have things like stronger emergency workers and things like that. I also think this means that society is to just being like better at surviving. Things like your ability to align with standards of attractiveness are going to take a lesser priority than innovating on things like how to consume less food or make sure that people don't have these like environmental diseases, which means that the innovation is unlikely to trend in a way of something that doesn't matter, like looking like 2010's version of Hot or whatever, and instead of going to be genetically engineering skin to not get cancer, that is a far greater priority for all the different actors that I told about as well. Speaker, this was not 0 sums, we were going to save people's lives. Okay.
I think it's time to broaden the scope of this debate and to begin talking about how this fundamentally alters the state itself. We have 3 points of extension. The first is on stratified humanity, which engages with the clash of open and half for 2 reasons. First of all, because of the fact provided that this will be provided on a global scale, and secondly, because of OG's push or burden push about the short term. And OO is right that this technology changes over time, but they do not provide the actual reason. And the reason is that things are harder to regulate once they are pervasive, which is why government's case is partly proving that point itself. I think the best example of that is things like artificial intelligence, which is why people are concerned about a gateway decision about artificial intelligence, because laws are very hard to unravel once they are culturally and legally inculcated, which engages with CG's point about incrementalism as well, because it's very hard to make discrete decisions at every single stage as this technology evolves. So opening government says under this that there will be a nebulous sense of regulation, and CG tries to win the debate by proving what OG has probably already tried to model in, but neither team ever answers the question of who is actually enforcing this. Is it an international body at an international level? Well, look to the status quo, the extent to which those bodies, such as the United Nations, are effective or ineffective. And the reason for that is because lots of countries have differences of opinions. And I think the best example for this is the question of morality. Think about the way in which certain compassion genes can result in you being compassionate about certain things. So, in a time horizon in the medium to long term, when you can alter compassion in certain ways, certain governments will have different ideas about what people should be compassionate about. Or is it domestic level? I'll engage with this in our second point of extension, but 2 points extraneously here. First of all, they say that governments are afraid of liability and insurance exists, which is obviously not true for the bulk of the countries with OG models in, which is the developing world, because most of those countries don't have strong systems of liability and insurance schemes. Or, second of all, I think importantly here, they say that the government will be able to legalise or regulate certain things. It's quizzical for the government bench. They seem to think the government has a monopoly of power when it suits, but not when it does not suit. So, proving this point of extension further, in terms of stratified humanity, even if we take government at their best, certain countries will have access to this technology faster, even if all countries have access to it. The reason for that is you need infrastructure to deliver this service. That looks in terms of both physical infrastructure and human capital. You need a middle class who is able to focus on these sorts of things. You need to have things like rights of choice with regards to things like procreation that already exist. And the impacts there are twofold. First of all, that creates a clear wealth disparity if you take government bench at their best. That is to say that this is a net good which makes people more productive and more economically productive. Or, secondly, I think this plays out in ways which is problematic in terms of narratives which stronger countries use to beat up weaker countries and to use them as subservient tools for their purposes. Because you can use destructive narratives such as that other countries are not as human or that they have backwards peoples in them, or you can say in a constructive sense there's a paternalistic need for us, the United States or whoever it is, to go into that country and deliver these services. And look at how that is so similar to the way in which, for example, neoconservatives or post-colonial endeavours work under the status quo. That is to say that you identify a gap, whether that is in ability to access that or just time of delivery, and then governments can use that for nefarious purposes for all those structural reasons that we've just provided. The mechanism here which I would like to add uniquely to this is the way in which this adds in terms of a collective action problem, again engaging with opening up. Note that even if it is true that only some traits are traits which people will choose, the point that we would add is that the traits that people would choose would have a high level of homogeneity, and by that we mean a high level of frequency with which people would think that they would take it in. And that's to say that obviously that we hear from Emily the point about stubbornness, but the most important example in this debate is actually the example of intelligence. And I think that obviously that they talk about things like survivability at CG, obviously that is correlated to intelligence. That is something which people would not choose against. But that is so problematic for the obvious reason that if everybody is smart, it is not necessarily true that they have all the activities to fulfill those needs and to feel like they are contributing to society. Though this debate occurs in the context of other technological trends such as automation, it is not true that everybody who is incredibly brilliant has the ability to use that brilliance. So in the short term, when people do not have certain jobs or certain jobs which need to be fulfilled, such as being a cleaner or being somebody who is less able to fulfill themselves intellectually, will not be filled by anybody, or if it is filled, people will be incredibly disenfranchised. And I think that the most likely result of the government then is to engineer a correlative trait in terms of complacency. And that is to say that when you have a highly educated populace, but as a government you cannot provide the tools for those people to actualise that intelligence, obviously the best trait for you to have in those people is one where they are unable to realise that they are not fulfilling that intelligence. Which leads to the second point of extension, I'll take a POA after, which is on state oppression and coercion. Opening opposition says people will be pressured to do this by their parents, their partners, or their employers. But by far, the strongest pressure will be from your government. And that is to say that governments, which are bad, will have a reason for you to engineer certain traits in their population, as will governments which are broadly described as good, because it would still correlate with things like economic productivity. So the traits which the state would be likely to encourage in individuals is things like complacency, things like a lack of critical thinking, things like a greater deference to authority, because it means you're less likely to question the incursions of the state into individuals, into the way in which it engages with other states. Think about the way in which this would play out the state's incentives with regards to the military. Obviously, the state would have a huge incentive to engineer into people who join the military as a precondition to that joining the fact that they do not question authority, because that is the incentive of the state. And this government bench wants every state in the world to have that power. I'll take opening.
Yeah, the reason why colonialism is bad is because you go into developing countries and you take away their autonomy and their rights. Why is going into the developing world and offering to cure them of diseases they would
Yeah, but the point is, you say that's what you're going to do, and then you don't do it, and then there's nobody to hold you accountable. That's how colonialism worked. That was the entirety of my first point. The final point of extension I would like to add is on religion, which is a good example of the way in which the stratified humanity extension plays out. You need to ask yourself, panel, how does this alter the relationship between the church and the state? First thing to say is it subverts certain religious narratives which are very largely entrenched in religious communities. DOI here talks about disability, but never impacts this, and the scale of religious adherence is much broader and much more deeper. That is to say, it changes the conception of what it means to be human in the sense of that you are no longer made fully in the image of God, which is something which people believe to a large extent. Secondly, the impacts of that in terms of discrimination are important. Firstly, it means that governments have an incentive and ability to breed out racial and ethno-religious groups. Secondly, it means that people who ascribe to a particular group are treated differentially and in a discriminatory way. And thirdly, it means you're less likely to seek services if you are from this group, because you will reveal your preferences and your affinity to the government at large. This needs to be weighed against open government. They may win the number of people who don't have children because of the fact that they're worried about potential diseases. Weigh that against the number of people who are religious, the number of people who are living in states where the state has the ability to coerce them and to oppress them, and people who live in states which are susceptible to the power of much stronger, much more entrenched states as well.
So our extension, which neatly integrates with why we beat opening government. Then I'm going to talk specifically about why we beat the additional contributions of closing opposition, and finally, I think least relevantly at this point, opening opposition. First, with respect to our extension, I think Stu makes a mistake of, firstly, just implying some things without actually proving them. For instance, the hypothetical is posed. Is this governed by an international body? To which the answer is yes. And here are 4 reasons why that is likely to be done well. First, there is some degree of consensus on how these things are done, e.g., everyone agrees there should be cooling off periods. Probably everyone agrees North Korea should have access to the material. Second, a lot of these decisions are extremely clear-cut, things like the use for it in terms of diseases. Third, certain countries control the IP for it, for instance, countries like the United States, which means that they're only likely to license it when certain countries agree to those preconditions. Note, there are obviously huge consequences when you abuse them, just like there are when you do any sort of similar thing which is tantamount to a war crime. Like, this team seems to think that no one is going to get pissed off if suddenly like North Korea just starts doing like ridiculous things and morphing them in the way they describe. Fourth, there are obvious corollaries in terms of things like global consensus on CFCs, regulation of the internet, all of those things seem to be good for us. The only other claim that integrates with our extension at all is like, well, it's harder to regulate something once it actually exists, but it's unclear why it engages with any of the substantive reasons that prove that we actually get to regulate it every single step down the chain. There was no response in that. All of our substantive still stand there, which is substantial reasons why governments were likely to regulate, how and why people were likely to lobby them for those reasons, how and why the government had those incentives, how and why the creators had those incentives. I'm not going to bother whipping them too extensively because they're on your notes, they're still in the debate. Importantly, this gets us up over opening government in every iteration of the debate because all of their analysis relies on this analysis. It is like there will be cooling off periods, but no work is done to prove that there will be cooling off periods, and it was not sufficient for them just to assert that that was likely to exist. So, with that out of the way, the second prong of our extension also gets no response, which is to say that we go over them by pointing out that even if there was no regulation, the substantial benefits that we brought in this debate were likely to win us the debate anyway. And this integrates nicely with the rest of what closing opposition talks about. The next prong of closing opposition extension is, well, there's going to be a sort of neo-colonialist need to enter other states. 6 responses. First, presumably the first priority is the domestic care of countries like the United States, and it's pretty hard to justify in the way they're describing if you haven't adequately cared for those people. Second, also note that means that your first priority when you enter them is to give them their healthcare and other basic things like that. Second, there is a huge degree of scrutiny and accountability when you enter a foreign country. The thing, actually think about how draconic and evil the thing they're describing is. They could effectively go into Rwanda now and take it over if they wanted to and enslave those people, which is effectively what they're describing. They do not do those things because they know that there is international oversight of those actions. It was evil, but it was not, they're not stupid. Third, they have incentives to use it well in order to get those countries on side. Fourth, there's skepticism if those technologies have been used poorly in the past. So if it is true that the United States abuses this in the US, the people of Tanzania are unlikely to say, yeah, hit us up with that as well. Fifth, point out that colonial narrative also exists here, which makes them very skeptical of those sorts of claims. Sixth, other states are probably doing this as well, which means that there is competition and people are likely to inform them. But seventh, it's just fucking obvious once it happens once in another country that you probably shouldn't sign up to that. It was a bold push, but it wasn't going to work. The next thing they said was with respect to encouraging complacency. I have 3 responses to this. First, there is just no adequate chain or mechanism established here. Like there is an assertion that there is going to be complacency indoctrinated. I'm actually not sure, is this the United States, is this North Korea? If it is North Korea, there's no meaningful change from the status quo in terms of a cult of personality, but if it is the United States, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. The reason for that is the ridiculous level of outrage that is likely to manifest when the government does this. I don't know what they think the United States looks like, but the outrage like from Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and stuff inevitably whistleblowing on these sorts of things probably means that no sane government is going to allow this because you will get sent to prison. I'll take you later if it's funny. Third, it's extremely obvious when people do this. Like, what are they thinking? You come back from the gene therapy place and you just start obeying all of your husband's orders because you're like complacent and servile. Like, there were clear genetic markers when that happens, but also the doctors themselves, the medical professionals, knew what they were doing and also would have to be in cahoots with this. So, at the close of closing opposition, the extensions, unfortunately, though bold and interesting, do not carry the debate, are not realistic, maybe later. So, let's turn to opening opposition. They have a few claims. The first is that they cannot fight for structural change, which I think is an interesting idea. Two responses. First, it is unclear why you should be forced to be a battering ram for other people who also have these sorts of afflictions, right? And the clear examples of this, which is the second response, is like, we do not ban people from getting surgeries from walking again, because it might lead to fewer ramps being built into the future. We don't ban people from getting cochlear implants because it makes it harder for the rest of the deaf community. Their second thrust is on consent. 7 responses. As I established in a POI, their reasons are reasons why they will be extremely cautious. Second, as we established and only we established, the regulation exists, which leads to the most informed choices. Third, even if it is about personality, how is it distinct from intense like psychotherapy and psychotropic therapy? They never establish it, we allow people to do that. Fourth, they're like, well, norms about features you should modify exist, but note that those social pressures operate in the inverse through things like plastic surgery where you say you should not get excessive amounts of that. The fifth thing to say is that when people do this poorly, it serves as a cautionary tale for every single other person and makes them less likely to do it. Sixth, the incentives of private companies not to be liable when someone fucks up this technology also exist. Seventh, like the notion that people would amend race doesn't engage with all of the huge taboos that already exist around this. I'll take closing.
The connection between outrage and outcomes is extremely tenuous. Even whistleblowers in the NSA and they still have prison. The Panama Papers show people avoid corporate tax and they still avoid corporate tax.
Okay, I think maybe there is a difference in scale between finding out that your neighbour was literally brainwashed by the government and being like, oh, these distant billionaires siphoned some money in Panama. Like any reasonable person has to see that your mechanism does not make sense. Finally, the last part is like a shift at Imogen to being like, well, we can also have this three combination idea. First, this concedes that the essence of the technology is good. Secondly, it undercuts the resource idea in Emily's speech. But additionally, like dealing with the best iteration of that, this sends a bad message to disabled people. 3 responses. First, it's unclear why they would not take this procedure once it is sufficiently safe, which means the people you're describing are an extreme minority. Second, if the procedure is not safe, as they seem to imply, you have a really good and justifiable reason to yourself why you did not undertake that procedure. Third, their life is just so much better in our world, right? Because in our world, maybe you are born with a disability that means you can't walk, but we get you the gene therapy that means you can walk a little bit more, that you can walk 2 hours a day. They were benefits that only we brought you. At the end of this speech and at the end of closing government, we clearly proved that the regulation was likely to exist. We removed closing opposition from the debate. Incredibly proud to propose.
Opening half in this debate get caught up in a discussion whether individuals are going to choose to use this or not and whether that would be good for them. The reason that we clearly win this debate is we talk about the impact this has when inevitably, for at least some characteristics which are determined to be objectively good by the claim from closing government, everyone chooses to use these things, and we're the side that says even when an individual characteristic is objectively good for that individual, the decision by everybody to take up that characteristic is objectively bad for society, and that is why we win this debate. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. The first is going to talk about our 3 points of extension. The first, state control and coercion. The second, stratified humanity. And the third is about how decisions will be made at homogeneity. Firstly, in terms of state control and coercion, note that there is no response to the material that Stu brings you except for the claim that this is able to be regulated now. What claims do they make to suggest that this regulation might work? The First is that there are certain controls you can have, such as IP, but we point to the fact that China already violates things such as IP all the time to suggest that these regulations won't work to the extent that they would like them to. No, thank you. The second claim that they make there is to suggest there will be a global consensus in the sense that people will be able to come forward and suggest that certain things are good, but we think there will be stronger countries which will form cartels to determine what those things are likely to be, and that will create stratification in and of itself. But the third thing that they say here is that there are some objective things. But note my introduction then. If you believe that there is an international body which regulates this material and regulates what decisions are able to be made, that automatically plays into our other piece of extension about homogeneity, because what it does is it says there is one body for around the world which says these particular characteristics are ones which we are happy for you to convert to. I will get back to that material later when I talk about that piece of extension, but I will flag now that the homogeneity extension did not receive any response at all, pretty much. The next thing I'm going to do in this speech is deal with stratified humanity. We make the claim that in the developing world, that in the comparison to the developing world, first of all, certain countries will get this better and quicker than others, and we make the analogy of paternalism and colonialism. The three responses we get from opposing government to this extension are as follows. Firstly, they tell us there will be a domestic priority from countries such as the US, because they won't want to be seen to be going into these foreign countries without helping their own population first. Okay, sure, you make your own population stronger at the expense of countries around the world. That is another loss for closing government as a result of that. The second thing they make no thank you is there is an incentive to get these countries on side, which Tanzania might just say that no, they don't want it. Again, if Tanzania is saying no to this technology, their population is further and further behind in the rest of the world but able to access these particular advantages. Third claim that closing government make in response is if it goes wrong once, then it will be stopped in future. I think that's an interesting claim, given that I think war and colonialism went wrong more than once and didn't get stopped in the future, and that is because of the power which these other countries are able to hold over others. That is why in the extension on stratified humanity and the subsection on developing world, we again win this debate. What is the second subsection we claim in terms of stratified humanity? It's about religion. The first thing we say here is that many people around the world who are religious will simply refuse to take this action because of the fact that it goes against the word of God. It says that human beings should have more control in the way that people are created. Why is that bad? Well, first of all, let's just note, if God does exist, then they will rain their wrath upon humanity at a point in time when they are controlling human beings in this way. And importantly, I think the average reasonable person in society is religious, so does believe that point, and that wins us the debate. But the second thing we say more seriously here is that people who follow religion will not do this, as I said, so they won't have access to these improvements. And at that point in time, the consequence of that action is that these people are left further behind. I would note, first of all, that there is a significant correlation between people who are religious and people who are poor, particularly in places in the developing world. But importantly, as a result of that, we think what that means is you can increase this stratification, and any form of stratification between different people in society in this debate is something that you should oppose. So on that extension, which again does not receive response, we will come out ahead in this debate. Let's move on to the third clash in this debate, where I'll engage more broadly with other teams. Because this comes down to this idea of homogeneity. Before you get to the idea of homogeneity, no thank you, you have to ask the question, how will these decisions be made? And I'm going to track this claim throughout the debate and prove that our contribution is best. Opening government, make the claim. Parents like seeing traits that they themselves have, and you wouldn't just make it, and Seb says, you wouldn't just make it as attractive as Seamus or as talented as Kevin. I think first of all, that's a lie. Obviously you would, and they should lose the debate for lying, because who wouldn't want a little Seamus with a Kevin brain? But secondly, people want their child to be better than them, or to be like how they think they are, or how they wish they were. So there's still this trend towards certain characteristics, rather than the claim that you'll just replicate it yourself and not what you see in other people in society. What is OO's response to this claim? OO says homogeneity is bad because there are some things which are perceived as negative characteristics, no thank you, such as stubbornness, but they might actually be good. I think OG do sufficiently to respond to this claim by saying that stubbornness has to genetically removed, that's tricky, but also you wouldn't discuss it amongst friends. And secondly, I would say that I don't think OO do a good job of recognising why homogeneity exists, nor why it is bad, and that is what I get back to in a second. Let's firstly note CG's claim no thank you, which is that OO just means you'll be cautious about what you opt into. Maybe that is true, but the consequence of that is that when there is this certainty around what is safe to do, or what is good to do, everyone will jump into it quick smart, because they see that as something which is important to them. Sure, yes.
So, you just conceded that opening opposition had troubles in this debate because they suggested that something like stubbornness might not be genetic. Then your extension is like, but instead they'll try to model in things like the gene of complacency.
Obviously that is one, like the third piece of our third piece of extension. But the important thing to say about that is also, things like intelligence, things like other objectively good things are known to be correlated with intelligence. What does CG say on this? They say regulation. They say, first of all, no thank you, you can cap the number of changes you can make. Obviously, this makes the stratifying point for us stronger, because if someone has a disability which they then want to get rid of and they're only allowed 2 changes, they don't get to do the things like intelligence and attractiveness which people who aren't on that disability are able to make. So that piece of regulation makes it worse for them. The second claim they say is that you limit the things that you're sure about. As I said, people will jump in at the point in time where they are sure. What type of things do we then structurally prove to ensue speech you would actually do it for? CG talk about survivability, and maybe that's true. They say it'll just be how to eat less food. That's obviously tricky. The thing correlated with survivability is intelligence, as we have rightly answered to earlier in this debate. What this means is that there is a collective action problem. Everyone wants their child to individually be intelligent, but at the point in time where everyone in society is intelligent, that is a bad thing. Because there is nothing worse than the crushing boredom of having that intelligence but being unable to use it because there is not demand amongst the jobs in society to give people that sense of fulfillment. Even if you don't bring in complacency, what happens at this point in time is these people are intelligent, or they are super athletic, for example, as the other example in the topic gives you, but they never get to use those particular talents or skills. That is something we should inherently regret, because everyone in society is impacted by the desire to achieve something which they are structurally limited from achieving. And for those reasons, as well as the other pieces of extension that we give you, we win this debate.